Imagine a ladder in which each rung represents $1 million of wealth. Now imagine the Australian population spread out along this ladder, with the distance from the ground reflecting their household wealth. On this ladder, half of all Australian households are closer to the ground than they are to the first rung. The typical Australian household is about halfway to the first rung. Someone in the top 10% is 1.5 rungs up. Someone in the top 1% is 5 rungs up. Gina Reinhardt is 5.5 kilometres above the ground. The rich are different from you and me, wrote an awestruck F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yes, wrote the more laconic Hemingway, they have more money. But why should we care about the gap between rich and poor? Shouldn't we focus on raising the bottom rather than how much wealthier the top are than the rest? Aren't discussions of inequality merely the politics of envy? Tonight I want to persuade you that inequality matters, that the gap between rich and poor really is an important public policy issue, even apart from the question of poverty. Inequality has costs and it has benefits, and policymakers need to think hard about the right level of inequality. So to begin, let me take a moment to review what we know about inequality in Australia. There's a plethora of measures of inequality, but I'm going to focus on top income inequality for 2 reasons. First of all, it allows me to look at a much longer period than any other measure. And secondly, I think it's very clear when we're talking about top incomes that we're talking about inequality and not about poverty. About a decade ago, I teamed up with the Oxford economist Sir Tony Atkinson on a project to use taxation statistics to learn about inequality. While regular surveys are conducted every few years, tax data are available annually. So we can create an estimate of top income inequality that goes back to the 1910s. And the thing that strikes you first of all is that for all the legends of egalitarian bushmen, early 20th century Australia was a strikingly unequal place. I'll come to the data in a moment, but let me remind you first of the character of the place. The Australian Club in Sydney and the Melbourne Club were elite institutions. True, an Australian gentleman, unlike his British counterpart, need not have been a man of leisure. These clubs admitted merchants and squatters from the outset, but great deference was paid to the elite. Large fortunes were made in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the super rich lived extravagantly. Retail merchant Samuel Horden raced yachts and bred racehorses. Gold mining magnate Walter Hall was also a racehorse owner and collected old masters' paintings. Then things began to change. From the 1910s to 1980, the income share of the richest 1% more than halved, while the income share of the richest 0.1%, the richest 1/1000th of Australians, fell by 3/4 from the period when Billy Hughes was Prime Minister to the period when Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister. The collapse of the super rich is vividly portrayed in William Rubinstein's book, The All-Time Australian 200 Rich List. Published in 2004, it covers the all-time richest Australians, from Samuel Terry, the convict Rothschild, through to Kerry Packer, because he's writing in 2004. So because Rubinstein covers 200 people and about 2 centuries, you would expect an entrant about every year or so. But the striking thing is that for 4 decades, 1940 to 1980, there isn't a single entrant on the all-time Australian rich list. Not one Australian wealthy enough to make the all-time rich list. Now, the closed economy of the 1950s and 1960s imposed costs on society as a whole. But nonetheless, this is an era marked by full employment for men, rapid increases in the ownership of cars and houses, and significant reductions in poverty. Yet Rubinstein writes that so markedly different were trends among the very rich compared with those for society as a whole, The post-war period seems to constitute, as it were, an age of affluence for everyone except the very affluent. Another writer notes that the wealthy at that time feel under some pressure to be accepted by ordinary working Australians, rather than the other way around. The fall in inequality in post-war years wasn't unique to Australia. Right across the Anglosphere, the pattern was very similar. Inequality fell steadily from the 1920s to the 1970s. Among the factors that made all of the English-speaking countries more equal over this period were rising education, high top tax rates, fairly closed economies and strong unions. And then, starting around 1980, Australian inequality began to rise. Over the past 3 decades, Tony and I find that that's Tony Atkinson, not Tony Smith, I should be clear, find that the income share of the richest 1% has doubled. The income share of the richest 0.1%, the richest 1/1000th of Australians, has tripled. The ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay has quadrupled. So after being absent from Australian life for nearly 4 decades, we saw the return of the magnate. In the 1980s, Rupert Murdoch, Kerry Packer, Alan Bond. In the 90s, Frank Lowy, Richard Pratt, Harry Triguboff. In the 2000s, Andrew Forrest, Ivan Glassenberg, Jenna Reinhardt, among others. On the latest BRW Rich List, 10 members of that Rich List would make the all-time Australian Rich List. Since 1980, 13% of household income gains in Australia have gone to the top 1%. The rise in top income inequality is reflected in sales of luxury goods. Prices for waterfront property, great Australian artworks have soared over recent decades, reflecting their scarcity. Over the past 2 decades, a bottle of 1971 Grange, which I'm assured is one of the great vintages, has increased in price at 3 times the rate of average worker earnings. Even cocaine, which Robin Williams once described as God's way of telling you you're making too much money, is being consumed in greater quantities. The super rich also donate more to political parties than ever before. In 2010, Graham Wood gave $1.6 million to the Greens. Clive Palmer gave $1 million to the Coalition, seeking nothing in return but pre-selection for a federal seat. I admit I was a little alarmed when I heard that Mr. Palmer intended to buy his way into Parliament, but the new head of the CIA, Bob Brown, assures me that there is nothing to worry about. 3 big factors drove the rise in top income inequality over the past generation. First, the returns increased markedly for those at the top of the field, what economists call superstars. Second, union membership collapsed. And third, top tax rates were cut dramatically. But should we care about inequality? Or do we take the view that then Workplace Relations Minister Tony Abbott put in 2003? In the end, we have to be a productive and competitive society, and greater inequality might be inevitable. Well, one set of arguments suggests that we should care about inequality for what are called instrumental reasons. Inequality, some contend, is associated with worse outcomes in areas that society cares about: health, crime, savings, growth. It's an argument I used to believe and one that I desperately want to be true, but my own research in these areas convinces me otherwise. The closer you get to the asserted effects, the more fragile are the findings. If there are negative effects of inequality on these social outcomes, they must be extremely small. I now think a better reason to care about the distribution of incomes is because humans have a palpable discomfort with high levels of inequality. As the father of 2 young boys, I can attest that my sons are constantly benchmarking one against another. In preparing for this talk, I asked my older son whether he would prefer that he and his brother both got 1 biscuit, or that his brother got 3 biscuits and he got 2. He chose 1 apiece. That isn't confined to children. A famous economics experiment is the ultimatum game. In that game, the first player decides how they would like $100 distributed between them and the other person. The second player then chooses whether to accept that division or whether to give all of the money back. So if all we cared about was being better off, then the second player should accept the division that gives them anything at all, because anything is better than nothing. So if the first player proposes to keep $99 and hand over $1, a second player who doesn't care about inequality should accept. Yet in thousands of settings, it's been shown that when people have a cut-off of around $25, below which they'd rather get nothing than receive a share they regard as miserly. It offends our dignity. It offends our sense of justice. Anyone who thinks that economics is about maximising money rather than maximising well-being hasn't got past first year. And once you're on to maximising well-being, inequality matters, because $1 brings more well-being to a poor person than it does to a rich person. There's also practical ways in which an increase in top incomes can reduce well-being for others. If people are competing for positional goods, a home in a desirable suburb, a place in a top university, a sought-after job, then inequality can lead to an expenditure cascade, as those in the middle have to spend more to stay in the race. When top incomes are modest, a young man can happily wear a $200 suit to a job interview. But if top incomes rise, he might feel a need to buy a $1,000 suit to compete for the job. Another reason to care about inequality is that it has the potential to corrode the polity. Campaign contributions themselves aren't a cause for concern, but we need to worry when donations buy policy outcomes that personally benefit the donor. My final concern about high inequality is that unequal societies tend to be immobile societies. When I studied the relationship between the earnings of fathers and sons, I found the degree of intergenerational mobility in Australia was better than the United States, but worse than the Scandinavian nations. A belief in social mobility sits deep in the heart of the Australian national identity. When we talk about what a good society should achieve, it's one of the first things that comes to the lips of politicians of all stripes. And yet we know that the more unequal a society, the less socially mobile it is. If high inequality entrenches poverty and plurocracy alike across generations, it might damage something that many of us hold sacred. The super rich in the future are more likely to be inheritors and less likely to be self-made. So what should we do about rising inequality in Australia? Preparing my talk, I went back and read the talks given in 1999 when the Sydney Institute hosted a debate on inequality between Craig Emerson and Julie Bishop. Both argued that education was the key to reducing inequality, and I think it's still the most promising solution. Indeed, we can think about inequality as a race between education and technology. If we improve the quality of Australia's education system, something that Tony is going to speak about, and improve early childhood intervention for the most disadvantaged children, then we'll make a mark on inequality. Targeted welfare matters too. Applying means tests and assets tests to the pension in the 1980s was politically tough, but absolutely essential to the sustainability of the system. Our Labor government's taken politically difficult decisions to impose means tests on the baby bonus, family tax benefit Part B, and the private health insurance rebate. And we also need to recognise, as Ken Henry pointed out in last year's tax forum, that progressive income taxes, not the GST, company taxes or Pigouvian taxes, are the best tool for redistributing income. Egalitarianism sits deep in the Australian character. Most of us tend to think that Jack's as good as his master, if not better. Most of us don't like tipping. If the plumber drops around, we'll offer him a cuppa. It's normal to sit in the front seat of a taxi. I'd say g'day to a cabinet minister as I would to a bus driver. We don't typically say sir to people in Australia. In fact, I enjoy the irony that the only knight that I know is my inequality co-author, Sir Tony Atkinson. In his study of Japanese prisoners of war, Gavin Dawes writes, "I began imagining that if human beings were worked and starved and beaten to the point of death, they would be reduced to barely functioning skeletons, scraps of biology, with all national culture and character trampled out of them. Not so. All the way down to starvation rations, 1,000 calories a day and less, to 100 pounds of body weight and less, prisoners of the Japanese remained inextinguishably American, Australian, British, Dutch. The Americans were the great individualists of the camps, the capitalists, the cowboys, the gangsters. The British hung on to their class structure like bulldogs for grim death. And the Australians, they kept trying to construct little male-bonded welfare states. Unlike Americans, Australians could not imagine doing men to death by charging interest on something as basic to life as rice. That was blood-sucking, was murder. Within little tribes of Australian enlisted men, rice went back and forth all the time. But this wasn't trading in commodities futures. It was sharing. It was Australian tribalism. My grandfather turns 90 this year, and for most of his life, Australia has steadily been becoming a more egalitarian place. It's only been in the last few decades that we've seen a rise in inequality, now creeping back up to where it was in the Great Gatsby era into which my grandfather was born. The risk is that too much inequality will destroy Australia's egalitarian spirit. There's many things about the 1950s and 1960s we would not want to keep. But one value worth trying to reclaim about that era was the sense of egalitarianism. Too much inequality strains the social fabric, threatening to cleave us, one from another. Australia is a stronger nation when we act together than when we pull apart.